Did you get both pages?
Yeah, he's east side. So take Sheffield Lake, Rain.
No, yeah.
East side of the
Okay.
Then it comes down all the way to there.
Good evening. I'd like to call this Utilities Committee meeting to order at 7 p.m. We'll do roll call. Mr. Miller.
Present.
Mr. Dembinski.
Here.
Mr. Winarski.
Here.
Mr. Cowger.
Here.
Mr. Nahorn.
Present.
And Mr. Van Turen is not here. I need a motion. Mr. Miller.
Move to accept his letter on file.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Mr. Dembinski.
Second.
Thank you. Members of administration are present except for the auditor, Mr.
Should
Cowger.
the motion include him?
You can make one for him as well.
Or we can make a second motion.
Mhm.
That's fine.
I'll make that.
Well, let's vote on that.
Oh, okay. All in favor of excusing Mr. Van Turen this evening, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. Mr. Cowger.
I'll make the motion to excuse Mr. Picard from tonight's proceeding.
Thank you very much. Mr. Winarski.
I'll second.
Thank you. And all those in favor for excusing Mr. Pidak, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The two are excused. Thank you. We have A-18-04 is our first item, the authorization to bid and award the 2018 tree trimming maintenance program. Would the Safety Service Director or the Mayor like to comment on this, please?
We do this every year. This is our maintenance program for all around our electric lines. It's been very successful. We really truly think this saves a lot of outages throughout the year. We did up it a little bit this year. We think we can do a little bit more of the city and even be more proactive with our program. So we've asked for $85,000 instead of $80,000 this year. And if you do want to add the emergency, it would just mean that we get it out to bid sooner. A couple tree trimming companies have contacted us. They said they're kind of hungry for work, so if we could get this out earlier, we might be able to get a lot more trim.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Miller.
Yes, move to take A-18-04. Looks like to the floor of council with emergency.
With emergency, thank you. Mr. Dembinski.
Second.
Thank you. We have a motion to take this to the floor of council with a second. And all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The vote is 7-0.
6.
Oh, 6-0, thank you. All right. I'll entertain any motions. Mr. Miller?
Move to adjourn, please.
Thank you.
Yeah, one other.
Oh,
got another
the second
one.
item, I'm sorry, thank you. Yes. We'll move on to item under utilities A-18-05. The acceptance of dedicated improvements, electric, sewer, streets, and water for the preserve at Quarry Lakes Phase 2. Mr. Mayor?
This is very similar. Last year you made an ordinance accepting the improvements of Phase 1. I would consider this very similar. The motion or the ordinance last year actually talked about the few, upon completing these few contingency items. Bramhall Engineering did a walkthrough with our utilities department, and they have just a few suggestions of outstanding items, minimum items that need to be completed. But we do think because of the way things need built, their platting and all, that this is a good time to accept these improvements. And I would leave it up to council, how they want to, the amount of readings that this goes through. I would probably do whatever they did the last time. And both Sean Brady and Mr. Bramhall is here if there's any questions for either one of them.
Would you like
Not
either one
Mr.
of them to
Bramhall, I'm
approach
sorry,
the podium?
Aaron from Bramhall. I gave him a promotion. Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Okay. Mr.
did
Miller,
recognize what I
do you
did
have
as
a
soon as I
question?
said it.
Yes.
And which attendee would you like to approach the
Thank you,
podium?
Mr. Chairman. I actually would like to hear from our engineer and his thoughts, kind of a summary of what is written here, and then I guess if Mr. Brady wants to chime in after, but I would like to hear the engineer's kind of thoughts or talking points on this issue.
Would you mind to approach the podium? Thank you, sir.
We did perform a final walkthrough, cold, rainy, snowy day recently with the utility department contractor. We do have a couple of minor outstanding items that need to be taken care of in the spring when the weather is going to allow that work to commence. The as-bills are on file. We've got everything as far as, I believe, everything is in the building department. Upon acceptance, the plat will be recorded by the developer as it goes up.
And that's our key focus right now, is just getting him to the next step to get the plat approved. And this list will be followed up with the building inspector and yourself, or just the building inspector to make sure?
And the mayor. They won't get a permit till these things are done.
I like the way you think, Mr. Costello. Appreciate it. So that would be the next step. I just want to make sure we all understand the next step. Okay. So this is the real work here is how much time, and I guess this is a Mr. Brady question, like how are you when it comes to time and filing, and how's this going to impact your schedule, staying on schedule? Thank you, Mr. I'm sorry, it was a two-part question, but it's two people to take it.
So the plat filing generally takes 2 to 4 weeks from the time that council accepts it. There are signatures by the administration and various members of the city that have to sign off on it, and they don't do that until council's passed the ordinance to accept it. But like Aaron was saying, there's a couple very minor weather-related items. We had actually a larger punch list in phase 1. Of course, the city always has the authority to withhold permits in the event that those things aren't getting done in a timely manner. And we followed through on everything else that we've done. So we would respectfully ask council to pass this and allow us to keep moving through the process. As a side note, things are going extremely well over there with sales. Ryan Homes has a 14 sale backlog right now, so that's good news. And so these lots will be well received by the market here in the late winter, early spring. So appreciate anything council can do to help move it along.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, what would you recommend for this in regards to the speed and how quickly we get it through?
This developer's been in the city a long time. They seem to follow through with everything else they've ever done. If it helps, if it's up to council, if the council wants to help him with his business and move things along, it's been done in the past with emergency and suspending rules. I've got the highest confidence that he's going to follow through and do a good job. So it's really up to you guys.
And you still have the ability to hold that permitted?
We still do.
So I don't foresee any reason why not to send this to the floor of council with emergency.
Are you making that motion?
If you'll allow me, I would like to.
Are there any other comments?
Give a second
Give me a second.
Second.
before you have any more comments.
Right. I'll entertain your motion, Mr. Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Do I have a second? Mr. Dominski?
Second.
We have a motion to take this to the floor of council with a second,
With emergency.
and we'll do a,
Can we open up
with
for questions?
emergency, thank you. We'll do a roll call vote.
Can we resume questions first, please?
Oh, yes.
I apologize.
Oh, that's all right, Mr. Winarski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. I need help with my memory here. We just did a punch list reviewing what? Punch list walk reviewing what? It said that
On this
just complete-
specifically, we've got a couple projects going on with this particular project.
Correct.
all the electric lines being put underground or, you know, in the streets, the curbs, all the infrastructure is built, the sewers. We followed through with inspecting all those, and this little list here talks about some of the things that needs to be done. A lot of them, like I said, are weather related. I do believe this is a smaller punch list than what was passed on phase one. Am I right?
So this is a punch list walk that was done for phase 2?
Yes. And it was given to you. That makes sense? And it was with our engineer, it was with our sewer department, our superintendent utilities, and the developer.
Okay. And help refresh my memory, when were we introduced to phase 2? When did we vote on that? The concept and approval that I was under the understanding.
You want
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah.
I think it was developed as a 3-phase plan, and it was all
Right.
at once.
I remember 3 phases. I remember talking about phase 1, but refresh my memory, when did we talk about phase 2?
So phase 2 was acted on in, let's see, there, I signed it. So back in February of 2017 was when, so it was before council in December, it was before planning commission, December, and then council had in January. As a follow-up to the original master plan, we put in phase 1, started that construction, and immediately came in with phase 2, council acted on it.
I apologize, I
No,
didn't
no.
remember February 2017.
And just
Discussing
for,
phase 2.
Right, yeah, I know, I get mixed up with the backwards dates too, but just for, just as a point of clarification, so what the city does is, once council gives us the permission to go ahead and install these improvements, and then says that they'll accept them if they're done according to plan, which is basically what happened last February. When we commence with the improvements, anything that's going to be accepted by this body, there's an on-site inspector for the city that watches it the entire time we're working. So then as that's being put in per our plan, at the end of it, we go to the city and say, hey, we've got all our stuff done, and they bring the inspector out. Aaron comes out from Bramhall Engineering, the various leaders from the different departments come out, they test the water, they test the sewers, they look at everything, and that's how a punch list is developed. And, you know, most of the stuff on this one, or a few items are seeding and just some very, very minor things that really don't have anything to do with the acceptance of the actual sewer lines or anything like that.
Okay.
So it's a pretty thorough process.
No, I don't doubt that for a
Yeah,
second.
yeah.
I'm familiar with punch list walks and such. But thank you, by the way, for refreshing my memory. Honestly, I did not remember that conversation.
We're gonna have the same thing with the reserve, because you guys passed it last year, and we're just now coming to the administration for a pre-construction meeting next, or actually this week. And so then the work is gonna start in the spring, and you'll probably see it sometime late summer, and the timeline will have to be refreshed then.
Thank you. Thank you. So what we're approving, in addition to the items mentioned here in the sewer electric streets for the preserve phase 2, there's a note here attached. We had discussed at one time that there would be a gravel road. We're doing away with that gravel road?
We are, and we've got an agreement, I think it's been forwarded on, it's been written by our law department. They kind of figured the value of the gravel road, and we have a backyard piece of equipment that we can use all over the city we've been wanting to purchase. So it was kind of good government, again, working with the developer. And instead, the only purpose of that gravel road is to get our big machine into these backyards and do maintenance. If we had this smaller backyard machine, we wouldn't need the gravel road. So they're willing to pay us the $15,000 that they would have spent on the gravel road to put towards this $50,000 backyard machine that we can use citywide. And I believe we have a signed agreement that they're going to forward that check for us
Right,
in lieu of that road.
in exchange for
Yes.
not requiring
Sorry
a
if
gravel
I
road.
went too long, but I really like the idea, so
Okay.
I really wanted to explain it.
And once again, I need help refreshing my memory. When we discussed the gravel road, wasn't there a component of safety services being, one of the reasons we wanted
different
it
things.
was for fire truck access?
This is two different things. This was a gravel road somewhat going into the backyards of all these lots, so we could service the sewer.
Going off Main Street?
No.
Okay.
This is something solely to service those yard drains and backyard sewers.
Okay, so this isn't the
The
gravel
safety
road
road
going
is-
onto Main Street?
Yeah, this has nothing to do with that.
All good, thank you. End of questions, appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Winarski. Any other comments? Yes, Mr. Carl.
Last time we did this, we also, as part of the ordinance, said that the city approves the final plat for, it would be for phase 2 in this case. I presume that's what we're also doing, right? We're accepting the improvements and approving the final plat for this phase.
Correct.
The mayor, you suggested that there could be contingencies.
There was the last ordinance, actually says contingent upon, phase 1, there was a little line that said upon completing these, I don't know how it's specifically worded, but I think you guys came up with it.
Oh, okay.
So if it could
I don't
mimic,
know if
if it
that's
could,
what it said. It's kind of like either accept them or you don't. So if we're accepting them by the passage of this ordinance and it's passed on an emergency, that, it seems to me that's what the city's done, is that it has accepted the improvements. I don't know if you can unaccept them because they have failed to do the punch items.
whatever you're comfortable
The punch
with.
list item.
We'll make sure these things get done, so however the ordinance,
Well, I think probably, I'll look at the other one, but I don't know. If there were contingent language in it, I'll look at it. But I guess I'd be a little surprised if there was. But,
So how do you recommend we move forward?
well, I think the ordinance, is going to have to be rather absolute on its face, that you accept the improvement, period. Now, there may be other things, other means by which you can compel the developer to finish the punch list items. For example, the subdividers agreement may require it. You can withhold the occupancy permits if these things are not done. So there may be other means of doing that. But I'm just suggesting that this might be an absolute acceptance when the ordinance is passed on emergency.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Miller?
Thank you, Mr. Channing. Frank, Mr. Assistant Law Director, I agree. I think my memory or recollection of our discussion last year about this time was that there were other mechanisms. Now, my understanding is once we send this with emergency, it gets passed, if it's suspended, the 3 readings are suspended and emergency is already on there, it's going to take effect immediately. We will have approved the plat as submitted. That punch list, my understanding, the last for phase 1, the punch list was there as a way to let us know the permits were not going to come unless that punch list was finished. So he can move forward with the plat. If I remember correctly, I think I even pushed it to get that plat moving to the county, because that was going to allow you to go to the next step.
Right.
And I think this is, again, doing the same thing. It allows you to get to the next step, but that punch list still has to be completed because there's occupancy permits. There's one other.
You guys have tons of leverage.
Right, we have leverage yet. And I think that discussion, my recollection of last year was, and I was concerned about that.
Right.
And I even asked you, I said, what's the next? And I think the same situation we're in again. Let's try to get you moved forward with the county. The county platting takes a while. We're getting ready to start into the spring season, I hope. And, off we go. But we still have those mechanisms. So I think you're right, Mr. Law Director. I think that we need to understand that when we vote this is saying to the county, we accept this plat in its entirety. And then the punch list needs to be just completed before we offer any occupancy permits. Does that sound right, Aaron?
It does. If I could add one other thing, there is a 3-year maintenance bond. That doesn't start until that punch list is 100% complete. So that's the other assurance and guarantee.
Good point.
Thank you. Any other comments? Questions?
Mr. Miller brought up the idea of not necessarily suspending rules on the first reading, and if that's the case, it will give you have up to 3 readings. If for some reason you have concerns this next Monday, you can always wait and you don't have to suspend rules. It will just, you could suspend rules on the second reading or not even suspend rules and go 3 readings, and then at the end of the 3rd reading, it would take place immediately. But I mean, you do have some leverage. You do not have to suspend rules next Monday if for some reason you feel that you need to wait. So even with the emergency on it, you still have up to 6 weeks that you can delay this if necessary.
Thank you for that clarification. Any other comments, questions? We still have a motion and a second to send this to the floor of council with emergency. We'll take a roll call vote at this time. Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Dubinsky?
Yes.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Mr. Nahorn?
Yes.
The chair votes yes. 6-0. Mr. Dubinsky?
Move to adjourn.
Mr. Cowger?
Second.
Thank you. We have a movement to adjourn, seconded, and all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We are adjourned with the Utilities Committee meeting at 7:21.
Thanks, everybody.
Yep.
Good evening. I'd like to call this Streets Committee meeting to order at 7:22 p.m. We'll use the same attendance roll call or attendance sheet as from the previous committee meeting. At this time, we have item number A-1806 off of streets, which is a resolution of necessity for the repair and replacement of public sidewalks and allowing the Safety Service Director to bid and award up to $500,000 for such repairs and replacements. Mr. Service Director or Mr. Mayor, would you like to comment on this?
Council started this conversation quite a while ago, and we went through a couple different processes trying to make this as good a process as possible and well explained to the public as possible. So where we're at now, I'm just looking for another resolution necessity, just to somewhat to make sure council's still on board with this program. And in order to, and if you notice, I sent along a draft letter that we put together. What this allows us to do, last year when we went to do this, there was worries about the time frame. We didn't give residents enough time to figure out what was going on, replace their own sidewalk, repair it, or whatnot. So we extended that. We sent out some letters. Well, now what this is going to do even further, it'll allow us to bid and award up to a certain amount of square footage based on whatever price the contractor comes up with. We'll pick out an area that we're going to repair and replace. And this, the sooner we get this passed so that we can bid and award it, it gives us a square foot price that we can give the residents with this letter, and then give them 2.5 to 3 to 4 months. Again, depending on how soon we get this out, up to 4 months of time, knowing what the city's going to charge, and then they can compare it with what they can get done themselves, and then come July, whoever hasn't fixed their sidewalk will get it replaced by the city, and then they'll have an opportunity to pay that price that the city, without penalties or without interest, and maybe even with a discount. And if not, then their taxes will get assessed. So again, what we're looking for is just a resolution that says council's still on board with this program, and allow the Safety Service Director to bid and award a square foot price for replacing sidewalks. And if you think this, again, if you think this is well worth the emergency, so that we can give the residents more time to search out their own contractor if they wish, just better information for the public.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We'll open it to, or the President of the Council would like to say something?
I would just like to note that everybody to take note that this is a public safety issue, and that's the whole basis of the work on the sidewalks. So an emergency would be appropriate, but that's up to you to decide.
Thank you. Any comments? Mr. Dembinski, questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Within this pool of money here, are the sidewalks that are owned by the city and also on that list going to be repaired out of?
We've been doing a certain amount of those, and we've got a pretty good chunk of our own sidewalks done. You know, one year we did about $60,000 worth of our own city sidewalks. Last year we did 15 or 16,000. I plan on probably continuing to use general fund money to fix our own city-owned sidewalks. I want this specifically to get as much out in the front of residents' homes, not city-owned sidewalk for this plan.
Okay. And then would it be possible to get an updated list or another copy of the list of those residents, just so we can kind of see that?
Sure, and then they all want, again, it's a pretty big list. This isn't going to do them all the first year. It's going to be an ongoing program. But we can definitely email you the entire list. And so quite a few of those names have been knocked off. I mean, there were some residents that got the letter last year that fixed their own sidewalks. There were people that called and questioned our reasoning, and actually after looking at it decided that maybe the city or whoever inspected it might have been a little bit aggressive, and we took them off the list. So just because you got the letter, doesn't mean you're going to still get your sidewalk replaced. We're going to continue to review it and make sure the ones that need the work are the ones that's going to get repaired and replaced.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dembinski. Mr. Miller?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple items on this. First off, being a public safety issue, I think there are some sidewalks that are just so bad that it would be a public safety issue. I think that we have more pressing public safety issues than a couple sidewalks that are not perfectly level. However, there are some sidewalks that are extremely bad, and they do need looked at. The questions that I have on this, if we're looking at sidewalks and public safety, and I've had conversations with the mayor, I've had conversations with council on the floor. My biggest thing is we have public safety issues. We had a resident hit by a car on the street that had no sidewalk. In a school, within one school block. Or one block of the school. I think that we really need to continue to focus on that. I really would have liked to seen when we started this approach, I would have loved to seen us come up with more of a sidewalk list that was not just those who had sidewalks that were not in agreeance to the ordinance, and this building inspector felt that they were out of code. I would have liked to seen the opportunity for residents that do not have sidewalks, especially in particular neighborhoods, to have those sidewalks put in. And then we say if we're hitting a certain zone, and that's another question, that'll be a follow-up question, when we hit that zone or that area that we're going to focus on, would we include those homes that don't have sidewalks? So we have some connectivity, so we have a continual walk that is safe for residents, getting them off the streets. I think that's a big issue right there. When snow comes, as you see now, and there's no sidewalk, they're out in the street. They're not going to walk in the slush and the snow and the mud in the front yard, the piles of snow that have been piled up by the plows. So this is something that I would have liked to see, not just around schools where we have some students walking, but I think throughout the entire city would have been nice to bring that into discussion with this. And maybe even if this drew out a little longer, we could have considered doing that as well. I know we have a streets I believe, Mr. Mayor, we have a street levy coming up for renewal.
We do.
And that would have been, that could be another time to have a discussion about connectivity and the opportunity there. I know we have an item in community development that we'll discuss as well. So that was the first part of this.
Can I speak on this first part?
Yes.
You talk about knowing where other sidewalks are. We are developing a map that shows portion of the city that don't have sidewalks, and we are working on a plan. One is safe routes to school, which is a pretty extensive, lengthy process. You have to develop a safe travel plan. You have to develop. It's a 2 or 3 year process, and we are working on developing a plan to apply for that next year. Probably will be around the schools. The complications of some of the new buildings this year made it somewhat more difficult because we didn't know what kids were going to be in what schools and what addresses. So you mentioned the other grant, so since we somewhat missed the opportunity to apply this year for the Safe Route to School, I did find another opportunity that you're going to talk about later, the bike path, which does get some safe travel towards the school with that program. But we are aware of the areas that don't have sidewalks, and we are working with a map, and we are working with a plan to apply for some of those grant monies in the near future.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I appreciate you keeping that in the forefront, that connectivity, that safe, pedestrian-friendly approach. And I think our city will be better served, and so will our residents, if we have that available. The other piece I had, Mr. Chair, if you'll allow, is it says tax assessed. Did we finally come to an agreement of how many years we're going to assess the tax if they decide to have a city?
I'll be flat honest, probably until it comes in and the bid amounts and the dollar, it'll depend on the dollar amounts. I don't know if we can split it up into 2 different groups, but there are some general guidelines, the amounts of monies and how long and what the life of the sidewalks are. So that will probably be figured out later, and that'll have to come back to you on another resolution of, I don't even know if it's called, what's the second? We'll have to come to council again, and you'll have to pass those rules. And I would say at a minimum of 5 years. But that'll have to come back for approval.
And then are we, if you don't mind, Mr. Chairman, are we looking at providing council at least, or us, or have you created a map of how you want to zone this out, like how you're going to approach it?
We're going to pick some of the worst spots first. I mean, you're going to be shocked. This amount of money is not going to go very far. So I would assume, like you might agree, I think the areas nearest to school, the worst sidewalks, the oldest sidewalks in the cities are probably going to get targeted first. Where the biggest concentration of these that we can knock off quickest will probably be what we look at first. So it'll be our utilities departments that are out and about, the building inspector, myself, and safety service director will probably pick those areas where we think we can get the biggest bang for the buck and get the most done and provide the biggest change. So there's a lot of criteria to look at.
Thank you. I have
Thank
no
you,
more
Mr. Miller.
or further questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr.
Thank you,
Kaminsky?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When we have new housing going into the city, are we enforcing that they have to have sidewalks? 'Cause I believe it was
99.9% of the time. You know, there are very unique situations where it might be one lot out in the middle of the street that has no sidewalks, and there are certain circumstances where it doesn't make sense to build them now, but if they ever do come to that area, they would be forced to put them in later. But our zoning, our planning codes do call for sidewalks in developments.
So the standard is at least to have new sidewalks.
The standard
in
is,
there.
but there are rare circumstances where planning commission decides it might be, and it would have to come to you more than likely for a vote most of the time if we do not have sidewalks in a development.
Okay.
But I would say it's a real rare case that it's not.
I just know there was a new house built over on Middle Ridge, kind of
And it
tower,
probably has no
and
sidewalks on either side of it for a mile.
It doesn't, yeah.
So that's why that one was probably waived by the building department.
Okay. All right, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Any other comments, questions? The chair has a couple. In relation to the letter that goes out, will that be a certified letter that's mailed? I mean, or is it?
By law, I think it has to be.
Okay,
It might not be return receipt, but I think it has to be certified, which just means they've delivered it.
okay.
We'll cost analysis. I mean, if it's better off that we know, I mean, we'll really look at that. We'll do what the law says by minimum, and we'll probably go even beyond that to make sure they get their letters.
Thank you. Second question would be, we talked about the Lincoln Sipple construction project. I can't remember if you said there were some on that list.
We
down in that
probably
area.
won't want to, there are some on that list, but we'll probably not want to interfere. Too much construction going on in one spot at once. We'll
Right.
probably be near that area, but we probably won't be on those specific construction zone of that project.
Okay. And were the sidewalks included in that reconstruction? Like,
No.
it was not. That's what I thought. Okay.
Now, if we mess somebody's sidewalk off, you know, we more than likely will replace it to what it was, but
Okay.
we'll do our best to avoid that.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions?
Just to answer
Mr.
your
Moore.
question, I believe it has to be by certified sign return, just like when you're serving any type of civil lawsuit, so we'll be required to do so.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Mr. Winarski?
I'd just make a motion to send this to the floor council with emergency.
Thank you. Mr. Nahorn?
Second.
Thank you. We have a motion and a second. We'll do a voice vote on this. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. Motion will pass 6-0. Mr. Cowger,
Move to adjourn?
we have a motion to adjourn. Mr. Dominski? Second. Thank you. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We are adjourned at 7:37. Thank you.
We will call this meeting of the Ordinance Committee today on February 5th, 2018 at 7:38 PM. The attendance will be carried forward from the previous meetings. We have one agenda item, A18-07, revision of ACO Chapter 913.04, surcharge rates and declaring an emergency. Mr. Mayor, this is something that you had actually found and would brought forward. Would you like to speak to it, please?
This might sound somewhat deja vu. This was passed last year, and when and after the replacement pages were already accepted, it had come to our attention that it really never got changed in those Walter Drain ordinances. So law department says the best way to fix this is just pass it again as we did the first time, and maybe when the replacement pages come out, we'll look at it a little differently, but basically just a way of fixing this. Simple as I can put it.
Thank you. Mr. Miller?
Move to take A1807 to the floor council with emergency.
Mr. Janik?
Second.
We have a motion and a second on the floor. Is there any other discussion? Seeing none, we'll do a voice vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? It passes 6-0. Mr. Winarski?
Motion to adjourn.
Mr. Cowder?
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 All those opposed? We are adjourned at 7:39.
easier on your chin. I'd like to call the Community Development Committee to order at 7:40. We have one item, A18. Well, let me get attendance here. I think we're just going to use the same attendance that was called for the last few meetings. And we'll go ahead and discuss A18-08, a resolution authorizing the Safety Service Director to file an application with the State of Ohio for financial assistance for public recreation trails and declaring an emergency. Mr. Mayor, you want to go ahead and speak to this?
Yeah, this is, we've looked at this a little bit in the past, but not real seriously, and it seemed like it was council's wish, and I think even yours, Mr. Miller, connectivity with our parks and walking and bikes. So this is an opportunity through the Department of Natural Resources to apply for a grant. There's actually two different programs. One pays 75% of the project, and the other, there's a bigger formula up to $150,000. So we do have an opportunity to apply for the same project to both grants, and it just kind of doubles your chances. There is a deadline, I believe March 1st for this program. We've sent a preliminary application. It really means nothing. It just gets us in there saying we're interested. We do need this ordinance passed before the March 1st deadline if council's interested. Aaron Appel is here. I mean, he is working on this application. So if you have questions for him, I think you've seen in the description, it's an asphalt recreational trail all the way from Beaver Creek Park, almost all, I think, all the way downtown, maybe other than a few small places that it really doesn't work well. And then I believe also down Sipple, and Sipple then would connect to the high school. So this gives us quite a bit of connectivity and just somewhat of a timeline. So it is a reimbursement type grant, so we would have to come up with the $200 and some thousand. As soon as the project's over, they would give us 75% of it back, or whatever the award amount that they would give us back. So I do have ideas for putting that money aside if it does come, and then we'll just replace it. So with that, this one's really up to you guys.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Before I take any comments or questions from the committee, if you have any questions on there is a colored map, and I'm
Bring a
not
bigger
sure.
picture. He did bring a bigger display.
Perfect. There's a colored map, and that right there is what you're looking at. So if you had any questions on that, as you could possibly see from where you're sitting, the blue line is the actual asphalt recreation trail, and it does pretty much connect the entire way from the Beaver Creek entrance up to the 5 Points, and then it does connect at Sipple and takes it all the way to pretty much the football stadium entrance to where there, which could go into the track. I really appreciate the mayor and of course Aaron have to do this really quick. Aaron was probably put to task in a short notice, and we really appreciate that. I mean, this is near and dear to me, as you can probably tell from years of begging for a focus of safety and connectivity in our city when it comes to pedestrian and bicycle. And one of the nice things about this that the mayor brought to my attention is that it is a nice wide path that can take both pedestrian and bikes. Is that still the case? And it would connect the Beaver Creek Reservation, which leads and can lead all the way across and up into Mercy, and there's a lot of opportunity here. You know, I watch a lot of these and fortunately drive almost into some of the high school cross-country track. They're out running the streets, they're out running some sidewalks when they're there and available on the streets a lot of other times. This is a fantastic opportunity for them to stay safe in their routes. It's a very large route for cross-country. It also provides us with opportunities to run events from the city downtown all the way to the Beaver Creek on this trail. There's a lot of opportunity here, and like the mayor had stated, there's a couple different avenues of revenue, of reimbursement for revenue. So, Mr. Mayor, I thank you for bringing this to my attention. I had not seen this until you brought it to my attention, so would have been unable to follow up and bring this to committee. So, of course, this is, I'm in full support of any chance we can to keep our city safe and connected. With that, I'd like to yield the floor to questions. Mr. Nahorn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. From what I understand thus far, it seems like a very good project, so I'm very excited about it and the opportunities that it will provide. Just briefly, termination. Where does it terminate downtown, and how does that occur?
So it would begin up by Sunrise at the entrance to Metro Parks.
Yes.
It would extend along the western side of North Main Street, all the way down to West Martin.
Okay.
And that crosswalk would be upgraded to enhance safety there. There'd be a enhanced sidewalk, ADA crossing at North Main Street and Sippel.
Okay.
And right now we're shooting for the south side of Sippel to connect it to the school.
Okay. And that very southern point, where exactly
On
is
North
it?
Main Street?
North Main, yeah.
Yeah, that would be at West Martin.
Yeah,
Right now
West
there's
Martin.
sidewalks connecting West Martin all
Okay,
the way to
right.
5 Points.
Very good, thank you.
Mr. Winarski?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Looking at the north-south run of this is only one block removed from what the Metro Parks proposed to us, we're going a year and a half ago. Has there been any movement from have we heard back from the Metro Parks? I know they were talking about going through Springer across the creek and then back up, and then they were going to enter into the Metro Parks down Long Street, if I'm not mistaken.
From what I understand, this is several phases removed, and there's still land acquisitions. You know, it may not happen for quite a few years in the future.
And I'm all for more bike paths, but it made me remember the conversation we had with the Metro Parks. I was just wondering where we were at with that. Thank you. That's all.
Thank you. Mr. Janik, then Mr.
Thank
Demick.
you, Mr. Chair. I think this is a wonderful idea. I applaud your efforts in coming as quick to the deadline as we can. My question is, for maintaining the snow removal and the cleaning of the trail, would that be our responsibility?
That's still up for discussion. I haven't really put enough thought into it. I've looked at some of our laws and ordinances. I'm stumped yet, but we've got a couple of readings. I would assume before we pass this and before we actually went into a contract, we would know those answers. But now I'm really not sure.
I mean, just considering the cost, though, we do have the funds in the budget, you would think, to keep it clean.
Again, I'm not going to make any, until I start looking at what the cost, what
Right,
type of
right.
equipment, what our sidewalk ordinances talk about,
Right.
people taking care. So I'll be honest, I haven't put enough time into that decision to give you an answer. Good question, though.
Thank you.
Mr.
further
Demick?
questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I agree with everyone. I applaud the different way of thinking and trying to find different ways of doing this kind of thing. This is the fantastic idea that I think Amherst needs more of. I'm biased because some of that's in my own ward, so we're also connecting a lot in the west side, which I think is nice. Being is that, where would the path physically be located? Is it an extension of the street? Is it in a resident's front yard? Where is it actually physically located in relation to like residents?
What we're trying to do is kind of hug the back of the right-of-way. So generally, either 60-foot right-of-ways, so 30 foot off the center line, just the back of the right-of-way. The path is going to be, in general, it's going to be 10 feet wide. In some sections, it may narrow down to 8 feet, to get around a utility pole or a utility that we just can't relocate. So there would be a tree lawn between the edge of the pavement and the edge of the asphalt path. And then 10 feet would take it to the back of the right-of-way, the public right-of-way.
Wait, I'm sorry. Could you say that last sentence one more time?
So you've got the roadway.
Right.
From the roadway to the path, there'd be maybe about a 5-foot tree lawn, and then a 10-foot path towards the house side.
Okay.
That would take you to
Okay.
the city right-of-way.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much.
Further questions on this?
Oh, no, I'm good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Dominski. That, you did answer one of the questions, just to make sure that we were clear on the width. Looking at that map, though, it looks like it goes past West Martin. Is that just that blue there?
But the map you
Extended?
guys might have gotten before we did some revisions. We noticed there's some real decorative brick walls and stuff on the top of the hill there that just wouldn't be conducive to a 10-foot wide. So we thought about leaving the funds for the portion that's more beneficial to a program like this, and then we'll figure out that section later. This will get them to within 1 block of downtown, to another set of sidewalks, at least. And it just because of the width of that hill, and if you drive through, like I said, there's a really nice retaining wall, and we would really hate to tear into that.
Okay. And that,
And the
I know where that
and the
retaining
funding
wall is
limits,
at.
That was a logical place to leave out.
So that would be just, it would turn into, basically, they would have to jump to sidewalk.
Correct.
Which
At this
is
point.
for, right. And at this point, right. Okay, so this map is probably an older map. And I hadn't seen that newer proposed. I would really have liked to see that get to 5 points where we could do some stuff with that.
And it eventually might.
Right. This is a great start. Mr. Cowger?
Just a question, if we're doing a 10-foot wide path and then 5 foot between that path and the street, how deep are the lots along Sipple where we're going to be pushing this? So, you know, how close is this going to come to people's house along Sipple? Until, you know, they're going to have people walking how close to the front of their house?
If you can imagine where the utility poles are, some of those utility poles are on the back of the right of way. So it'd be from the utility pole, that's where it would start, and then 10 feet towards the road.
Okay. You don't know the front yard depths, average depth along that
I
area?
don't know those
Okay.
Would Sipple be a little narrower street, Nick?
It might be.
Some of North Main might also, some of those houses are pretty close to North Main. So it's, you know, it's gonna bring this pretty close to people's houses.
Just, Mr. Pell, commenting to Mr. Cowger, and he's got a good point, we need to make sure that we respect people's frontage. The poles are a good look. I went through this, I went this route all the way from 5 Points down there. And my recollection is there's maybe 3 homes where it would just be tight. But the rest of the west side of North Main is actually, there are some deep frontages. And I don't believe this is really going to impact them, and half the time the poles are still on that side. There's no sidewalks on most of those lots. We just now have connected on frontage that has no sidewalks with this grant, if we can get this. I mean, this is still a hope, but I really...
They scored, actually, so you know, there's no guarantees even if you
Right.
apply.
But this really could be a start. And I think our residents may get a taste of this and say, this is good. How can we maybe work this into our plans for other areas where we're in need of this type of pedestrian and bike, you know, cycle access. So I only saw a couple houses, and I think it's right around the curb, if I remember, north of East Martin. I think, I can't remember. But I remember most of North Main, the frontage is quite extensive. But I think Mr. Cowger's right, there's a couple spots we may want to take a peek at and make sure. But, you know, this is now, what, year 6? And I don't think I've seen, since the mayor's arrived or since Bramhall's been here, that I've had them present anything that doesn't respect that. I think we're good. I really appreciate how you approach our neighbors when you provide engineering, and I think this mayor's doing a really good job of keeping those interests in mind as well. And I'm sure we're all going to be here keeping an eye on it. But I feel very confident right now in the mayor and Mr. Appel, and making sure that we do take into consideration what Mr. Cowger is asking, which is extremely reasonable. Mr. Janik?
Motion to take A18-08 to the floor of council.
We have a motion on the floor to take A18 to the floor of council with emergency as written. Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Okay. And can I have a second on that, Mr. Dembinski?
I'll second that.
We have a motion on the floor to take A18 to the floor of council with emergency. We'll just do a voice vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Ayes have it. Moves to the floor of council with emergency with a 6-0 vote. Mr. Janik?
Motion to adjourn.
Mr. Dembinski?
Second.
We have a motion and second to adjourn. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Ayes have it. We will adjourn at 7:56. I think I need glasses. It looks blurry. It's not good.
I'd like to call the Finance Committee meeting to order at 7:57. We'll carry roll call forward. However, with Finance Committee, I'm going to need a motion to suspend council rules so that we can continue without the auditor.
I'd like to make that motion that we suspend Council Rule 18B.
Mr. Nahorn,
Second.
any comment or question on this? Seeing none, we'll do a voice vote. All those in favor of suspending Council Rule 18B, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, like sign. Motion carries 6-0. First item on the agenda, A1809, an ordinance providing for the issuance and sale of not to exceed $2,500,000 or $500,000 of notes in anticipation of the issuance of bonds for the purpose of paying costs associated with the Lincoln Sipple infrastructure and resurfacing improvements and declaring an emergency. Mr. Mayor?
If you don't mind, I'd like to talk about the next two, both items, this one and the next one. They're very similar. They will be sold as one sale for anticipation bonds, but they need to be separate ordinances because of the way they'll be paid and all. We've been working with Squire Patton Boggs as a bond counsel, and these are pretty significant projects that we can spread out paying for over time. What I've been told and what makes a lot of sense, the actual dollar amounts aren't really set in stone yet. So I've been counseled that these bond anticipation notes are the best thing to do. They're a kind of a loan for 1 year. The language within it talks about, not to exceed the estimate of 4 or 5%, but the rates are right around 2% now. It's just somewhat boilerplate language. So we would have to use Squire Patton Boggs as our legal counsel. Then we would have to go out and either with banks or buy the bonds on the open market, and we'll shop around to get the best rates for these. But what this does allows us to borrow the money. I think Lincoln and Sipple, some of the money's due is going to be as early as April, and we'll have to start coming up with funds for that. So we're on somewhat of a timeline, but both these can go 3 readings, and it doesn't put us in a crunch, and it does give us time to go out and buy these bonds either on the open market or through a bank or have them sold as bonds. So we've got options that we'll work with bond counsel on how to purchase them. If you have any questions, I'll try to answer them for you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
But again, these both have to be passed separately.
Right. Mr. Dembinski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Originally, when these kind of came forward, I was somewhat cautious, just because I understand a city is not personal. However, I try to run with as little debt as I can in my personal life. knowing that, I actually reached out to the auditor and deputy auditor, and they were both very good in answering my silly questions. I actually feel better about these two because at the end of 2018, we will have two rather large notes that are going to be becoming mature, and they will be rolling off of our books. At the same time, we are putting on an additional $2.5 million that we approved last year for the metering project. But in my mind, currently, we're doing all right. And if we have, I believe the notes that are rolling off are 2.1 million and 4 point something million. So we're actually putting on less than will be coming off still. I think this personally might, if something else came forward to ask for more bond money later in the year, I would look at it much harder, knowing that I don't want us to get to the point where we're taking on more debt than is reasonable. But at this point, I think because we're putting on less than we're taking off, it's actually, I feel better about this than I did a few weeks ago.
Mr. Mayor.
Just talk a little about further what the plans are, you know, on top of those bonds that are becoming mature and we're going to lose them because they're paid for. There will be $1 more million we'll probably have to go out for Cooper Foster Park Road. About the time we'll have to reissue these after the bond anticipation. But also at that time, I've been counseled that some of our other bonds that we have at higher rates will be able to be refinanced. And really, with even borrowing more money, we still might have the very similar monthly payment because of the refinancing of some of these bonds that we have at a higher rate. So we're going to be looking at our whole package at that point after these one-year anticipation notes are done to see what's best to refinance. And we'll probably add that other $1 million for Cooper Foster Park Road at that time.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Miller?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And we have to wait for that year for those other notes. Is that what we're bound to before we can refinance
No,
them?
but you're paying for interest for it. It's one of these deals you're going to pay for a year's worth of interest, whether you do or not. So,
Okay, so we're contracted to pay interest all the way through and one more year on that.
no,
The reason I say that is
I
looking,
understand that we make 2 6-month payments on this note, on these 2 notes.
just looking at the bond market right now, I foresee bond market going up. Our interest rates are going to be phased in, I think the Feds. So the rates are not going to stay this low, and I think the sooner we get on this, the sooner we apply and collectively bring these together, we get a better rate, we get our fees, better bang for our buck with the fees, my understanding is speaking to the auditor, and if we can refinance these all in one with, as Mr. Deminsky said, those 2 rolling off, I think we look at that seriously and we look at it quick because these bond rates are going to start moving, I believe, just from what the market's showing right now. So,
But again, we don't want to borrow so early that we've got
Sure.
interest payments on money we're not using yet. So you know, there's a timing issue there.
right. Another reason I was asking, like, where are we at with that? But thank you. I support the idea.
Thank you.
Mr. Dembinski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually just agreeing with Joe. Everything that's pointed that the Fed is going to start the Fed is going to stop doing as much quantitative easing, which means that over time the bond and other Treasury notes should be increasing over time. So this is a better time now to take on new debt than it would be later on. Just, I'm not an economist, but from what I've read and seen, that's most likely going to happen soon. So, sorry, that was all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any others? What's council's pleasure? Mr. Dembinski.
Motion to take A-18-09 to the floor of council with emergency.
Mr. Winarski.
I'll second.
Any further comments or questions? Motion and a second on the floor to take A-18-09 to the floor of council with the emergency. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, like sign. Motion carries 6-0. Next item, A-18-10, an ordinance providing for the issuance and sale of not to exceed $500,000 of notes in anticipation of the issuance of bonds for the purpose of repairing and replacing sidewalks and declaring an emergency. Mayor spoke about this with the last one, Mr. Dembinski.
Move to take A 1810 to the floor of council with the emergency.
Mr. Nahorn?
Second.
Any further comments or questions? Mr. Wienerski?
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. We're looking at $500,000 in case we have to pick up the tab and then assess property owners for work that's being done on sidewalks. Do you have an idea how much, what percentage of the total project is this going to take care of? Maybe a quarter, a third of the sidewalks out there? Is it too early to call?
It depends on how many do themselves, but I'm guesstimating this is about a fifth.
Okay.
At that rate, if we divide, I'd like to do it in 4 years, but I really thought more than this would be too much to bite off.
Exactly.
So
I'd
this
like to
is-
applaud you for that.
This is a good number to start with. We might find a chain reaction, people fix their own, we might. So this is just a good number to start with.
Yeah. The availability of qualified people to do the work too. We start small. Let's
Yeah.
learn. We can grow it, we can shrink it as time goes on. So I just tip of the cap to you for this approach. I think
Thank
it's
you.
rock solid. Another thing, just kind of keep in the back of the mind, talking to neighbors about the Lincoln Sipple project, if we could just maybe, if we're going to be sending these letters out, if we could avoid that area, and I think you already
I'm
addressed
absolutely
that.
avoiding that area at all costs.
Okay, thank you. Was there one other question? No, that's it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Miller?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Mayor, is there, I'm trying to figure out, with the school coming down and the lack of pedestrian traffic, is Shoup, Sunset, and Idlewood really, I mean, I really don't want to question your priority here. It just says, here's a list.
That's for the street.
That's a street program.
That's street.
Oh, sorry. I apologize. I flipped that over. Please strike. I'm flipping pages and I looked at that
You're
list.
absolutely right, Mr. Miller.
That-
With your suggestion, we won't do sidewalks.
Good call, and I appreciate that. I'm looking at this, I flipped my page and I'm like, what is going on here? Yes, thank you. Flipping to the wrong page. Strike that. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. No further questions or comments on
Thank you,
that.
Mr. Miller. Anyone
Sorry.
else? Seeing none, there's a motion to take A 1810 to the floor of council with the emergency. Voice vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, like sign. Motion carries 6-0. Last item on tonight's agenda is A 1811, authorization to bid and award the 2018 street rehabilitation program.
This
Mr.
is,
Mayor.
Hey, now we're there.
This is typical. Mr. Paul's got a color map. You see one in black and white. We'll try to start working when we send those things in color that you guys start receiving them in color. They're a whole lot easier to see. But this is our proposed street program for the year, a little over $1 million. I am working on the budget. There might be some general fund money. Last year the winters were good enough. We had some money from the SALT program. Income tax collections and different things, with money we didn't spend. There still might be some additional monies in this year's general fund that I can expand this program. So you'll notice there's, maybe by the second reading, I'll have an expansion number for you, but as it stands, this is the program. Now, asphalt overlay in all these areas. If you have any questions, Aaron could probably answer them. If you have specific questions about the project itself.
I just noticed.
Oh, you're
Mr. Banner.
Oh, thank you,
Good.
Mr. Chair. I've noticed the area heading east on Cooper Foster. I think you mentioned Cooper Foster previously, is getting really bad in terms of repairs that are needed
right.
towards the the plaza area where the new Planet Fitness is?
That's been looked at for quite a few years, and we've got some funding from NOACA, which is the Northern Coordinating Area that gives us funding from federal dollars. And we got to share that project with Lorraine, and they've decided to give us, and pretty confident now, $2 million towards the project there, but those funds aren't available till late next year. This project, Cooper Foster's been planned for probably since 2005. You know, I would guess if we knew now what we knew, or knew then what we knew now, we'd have probably paved that area, put an overlay or something. But we're doing the best we can with the Durapatch machine, so we're going to struggle through one more season of patching it, keeping it smooth as absolutely possible. And I'll give a little plug to Amherst News Times. I think they just did an article about that stretch of road, so he's got some good information on that project in the paper.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Mr. Dembinski?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe late last year, we had received a letter from the school system asking us for some help with road reconfiguration around the new buildings that they're putting in. Is that something that might still be on the table, or is that something that we would need to revisit later on? Just trying to be a good partner with the school system going forward also.
We've had some discussion with the schools. It's not part of this year's street rehab program. That's going to be some new construction if it happens. So we are in talks with the school. They've done some work with what they're going to do within their own property to do something more with their traffic. So we're looking at that. We've talked about partnering in a new traffic study to see what could be done with that intersection, so that if something gets done there as a partnership, that'll come to you at a later time. I didn't want to fog the issue of our regular road program with something as complicated as that. So we're still looking at that.
Okay, thank you. That is all. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Still looking for a motion, if anyone wants to make a motion. Mr. Wienarski.
I'll make that motion to send this to the floor of council.
Mr. Dembinski.
Second.
Any further comment or question? Seeing none, there's a motion to take A1811 to the floor of council. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, like sign. Motion carries 6-0. Mr. Miller?
Move to adjourn, please.
Mr. Dembinski.
Second.
All those in favor of adjournment signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, like sign. We stand adjourned at 8:13.
Thank you for asking that.
Well, I think it's important. It is important. I believe in.
There actually has been some movement.